listening to the Straight to Video podcast with Rob Lane.
All right, welcome along to a brand new Straight to Video podcast. Rob Lane here as always, and hope you're doing great. Today is a bit of a treat for anyone with a love of 80s horror movies, as I welcome illustrator and designer Graham Humphreys to the show. Now, if you rented splatter horror movies during the huge boom of VHS in the 80s, then I'm pretty sure you would have chosen a film based on Graham's superb artwork. In the horror genre, things don't get much bigger than The Evil Dead and A Nightmare on Elm Street, and Graham is responsible for the posters and VHS sleeves of both of these films when they were released here in the UK. My first encounter with Graham would be at one of the MCM Comic Cons, maybe around 2014, when he was guesting on the Arrow video stand. I remember seeing this guy busily working away on some killer poster art with a portfolio boasting prints from all these classic horror movies which I grew up watching. Scanning through the pages, seeing the iconic Nightmare on Elm Street 2 poster, the brilliant Return of the Living Dead artwork. Surely this wasn't the guy who did the originals way back in the day. It must be someone working on reworkings of the originals, right? Firstly, he looks way too young. And secondly, this guy's a legend. There should be a huge queue of people wanting to grab his autograph. But that's Graham. Despite being a force in horror history and making a mark on the growing up of thousands of fans, he quietly goes about his business, letting the artwork speak for itself, happy to sign any video covers brought his way and casually chat to anyone who wants to talk. He's just the best, basically. The last few years have seen Graham busier than ever. With the huge resurge in popularity for all things horror, he's found himself with endless poster artwork for live events and book covers, even compiling his work into the recent book Hung, Drawn and Executed, which is available now, and he has a brand new exhibition of his more recent work at the Orbital Art Gallery in London called The Colours of the Night, which runs from the 3rd of September until October the 1st. And all information on these and Graham's amazing body of work can be found at grahamhumphreys.com. Okay, as there's an artwork theme to today's show, I'm happy to have the wonderful folk at Affinity Software support this episode. Affinity are the hottest name in digital drawing and image editing software, and what's cool is there's no crazy subscription you're tied into, just a great fair price for the packages they offer, and since being turned on to them last year, I've never looked back. For more information, check out affinity.serif.com. Also want to shout out to our friends at Dead Skull Coffee for the ongoing support of this show. If you'd like to grab a nice 15% discount on their ground or full bean coffee, then head on over to deadskullcoffee.co.uk and simply add the promo code STV on checkout. What's super cool is that Dead Skull Coffee have just today released their first signature blend, which is with the guys from Thunder. Yep, Danny and Co have now got their own Thunder signature blend of coffee, so check that out over at deadskullcoffee.co.uk. Alright, let's get into this chat. What I learned during my conversation with Graham is that he was there doing all these cool points over the years which would have a direct effect on his career. You'll hear us chat about how 60s TV shows and Hammer horror movies would spark his interest in fantasy and adventure before heading to London and diving into its music and cult cinema underground, and then catching the wave of the huge VHS and horror boom of the 80s. Really must have been wonderful to experience all of that firsthand, but it certainly was great to hear it from the man himself, so I hope you enjoy my straight-to-video chat with Graham Humphreys.
How are you doing?
I'm good, mate. I'm good. How's things over there?
Not too bad at all, thank you. Literally just finished, I'm doing this poster for, the Whitby Tomorrow's Ghost Festival. A friend of mine is interviewing Victoria Price, daughter of Vincent Price. So she's a special guest there this year. They wanted to just have a poster, which is a picture of Vincent and Victoria. Been on a few tours with her, just exploring some of the places that her father liked going to, what are described as the Vincent Price Legacy tours. And we've been to Spain, to Bavaria, Wales, not quite as exotic, but actually a very beautiful place anyway. Funnily enough, lots of graveyards as well. Of course, Victoria's not a horror fan. She doesn't really know a huge amount about her father's horror legacy. She knows her dad more so as a dad who doted on her. And, she's more focused on his love of art and just wonderful places and exploring the world that he was able to go and visit.
So she's probably learning as she goes along on all these journeys, hearing all these stories about her dad. That must be cool for her in a way.
We've been doing the tours with a mutual friend, Peter Fuller, who basically runs the legacy in the UK. So he's responsible for anything that happens here in Britain. But he organises the tours with her. And of course, he's a big horror fan. And so really, she's learning all about her dad's horror films. And also, the tours, which were very focused on, you may not know that Vincent Price was a gastronome. He was a man who liked his food, and he'd written a number of recipe books with his first wife and liked to travel around visiting, sort of various restaurants, which not necessarily because they were expensive, but because they were renowned for the sort of food he liked, which was, I describe it as very much 1970s food. It's like everything was going to give you a heart attack. He loved. So really the focus of the tours was initially on those two twin loves of his, the art and food. But as it's gone on, Pete's been programming in sort of horror locations. And when we were in Spain, we went to Toledo where they shot Lisa and the Devil, for instance. That was great for us. It was kind of a bit of a mystery for Victoria. However, she has learned to enjoy the pleasures of the cemetery now.
Nice.
We mostly program in horror-related stuff nowadays, and less emphasis on the food and art.
Yeah,
more on
sure.
horror.
Well, I'm going to throw things back a little bit, Graham. You've lived and worked in London since the 80s, but you're originally from West Country, Bristol area. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah. I was actually born in Gloucester, I believe. That's what's on the passport, so it must be true. Grew up on the outskirts of Bristol, a place called Winterbourne Down. So it's kind of pretty much in the countryside, really. I mean, two things I remember about it. There was an amazingly large viaduct there for trains. I mean, just, this one of those fantastic, enormous Victorian pieces of engineering, which it was quite an amazing thing. The other thing was my grandmother owned what was essentially a local shop for local people. I mean, it's very League of Gentlemen in many ways. What I do remember was at the back of the shop, there was a garden with a fence, but the other side of the fence was essentially a quarry with a huge fast drop. And I remember my grandmother and my dad building a swing for my sister and myself to use, which seemed dangerously close to the fence.
Holy shit, yeah.
Swung up, you're kind of overlooking the quarry, which didn't seem like a very health and safety wise kind of thing to do.
But I bet it was awesome.
Yeah, well, and if I get a train to Cardiff, for instance, it goes kind of just past through its Bristol Parkway station, and you can actually see the quarry edge from there. When my grandmother left there, she moved with my parents and myself to Wiltshire. I have been back a couple of times into the area, but I don't really have any roots there, to be quite honest. I've got more connection to Wiltshire because I went to art college in Salisbury College of Art, where I did graphic design. Well, I've sort of got all the grounding for everything. So the illustration side of it was kind of a little bit later that I did a fourth final year, an extra year where I did specialise in illustration. But I kind of realised that every graphic design job I did, it always ended up with some sort of visual element, which was not photographic or text. So I obviously steered myself into illustration quite quickly anyway. And, certainly as a kid, I used to draw all the time anyway.
You was drawn to art right from like a super young age, like 3 years old, was it, or something?
Yeah, that's true.
Anyone else in your family artistic?
Well, I think my mother could draw fairly well. I mean, it wasn't something she ever pursued as a career. She was a nurse, in fact, working in an eye hospital. And given the fact she was incredibly squeamish, I think eyes are one of the most squeamish things you could ever work on. She gave up that when I came along and just became, full-time housewife as such. But my father was a draftsman, and so he had, technical drawing skills. So, one presumes that within those two, there was a sort of an aptitude which was, kind of in the DNA, I guess.
Can you remember what it was? Was it superheroes and monsters you were drawing?
It was just two things, Daleks and skeletons.
You grew up in like the golden age of TV, especially like those classic American TV shows. You've mentioned Lost in Space and The Munsters and Doctor Who. Was that something you enjoyed with the family, or was it just you?
I think it was probably my preference difference. I mean, the nature of the TV being in the living room meant that everybody else was forced to watch it as well, though. But given that the fact wasn't much on otherwise anyway, so you're kind of limited to 2 channels, and that was kind of it. And of course, we were watching all that in black and white at the time as well, though, even though, a lot of stuff was already being made in colour. Really, it wasn't until I was about 12 or 13, I don't think we had our first colour TV. So I saw everything in black and white, but it didn't matter because, I mean, in a way that kind of focuses your attention anyway, though. You're not distracted by pretty colours. You're kind of just looking at the content and the dialogue and, all the basic stuff. I was lucky, as you say, that was, all my early childhood stuff. And then, of course, in the 1970s, I was born in 1960, so, the 60s were very much that was the TV stuff. And then in the 70s, I was kind of, as I was a little bit older, I was able to start watching the Universal horror films. And then they do runs of some of the earlier Hammer films on TV as well. And so I was what would be termed, like a 70s monster kid. There are a number of books which kind of deal with the subject in terms of all the stuff was like basically influenced by the Universal horror films, and kind of Hammer were basically remaking those in their own kind of way. We kind of all found out who Frankenstein's monster was and who Dracula was, and even if we weren't old enough to read the source material itself, then we all kind of knew who the characters were. Quite amazing how it kind of played through into popular culture, and not just the kind of plastic models you could buy in the department stores, but everything from stickers, comics, magazines aimed at boys, basically, just full of photographs from all the Universal films and then a little bit later the Hammer films as well. So even though we weren't old enough to go and see the films at the cinema, you could just fill your head with all the images there. So it's quite amazing, really. And even weird things like the TV stuff, like, for instance, I don't know if you remember this program called The Golden Shot. Basically, contestants would be given a crossbow. It wasn't mounted, so they couldn't just run around the studio killing people. But the idea was that you had a painted image which would be themed according to whatever was going on that week. There was always a theme. It might have been about 3 or 4 different ones they had with different targets on, and they'd be moving targets within the picture. So the idea was that the person was blindfolded with a crossbow, which was a really bad idea. And then they would have somebody who would then prompt them to aim, left, right, up a bit, down a bit. The idea was that, you'd try to get that person to hit the bullseye on the target. They'd have a guest each week. Peter Cushing was on once, and then Christopher Lee was on another time. So, of course, all the images were themed with horror, which is fantastic. And then you'd get a little clip maybe from some of the films they've been in as well. So they're kind of little scraps from the table that you could get. But it's sometimes that was the only way you could actually see clips of the films in random TV at the time. But, all those little things you cling on to because it's almost like forbidden fruit in a way, though. And it was just like, making you even more interested and keen to find out more.
I think you've said before your first horror you actually saw was Fiend Without a Face, which is is that like a late 50s?
It is. I mean, some of those science fiction horror films from that era would be screened on a Sunday afternoon, even, or Saturday afternoon. I think they were considered so tame it was okay for kids. So it wasn't like late night viewing at all. It was like in the middle of the afternoon, so like just as 8-year-old kids, you could watch what would have at some point in the past been an X film, which is bizarre. But I do remember around that era, probably the most disturbing thing I ever saw. I mean, that frightened me, that particular film, Fiend Without a Face. But I think it was Laurence Olivier in a film adaptation of King Lear, and it's The Blinding of Gloucester. And I do remember this scene where this guy's been having his eyes gouged out and then presented in a sort of napkin, essentially. This is a bit tough for a Sunday afternoon.
Stuff like that etches itself into your head.
No, but horror pops up in the weirdest places, though, and not necessarily in horror films. So extraordinary, really.
When did cinema come into play? Did you guys have a local cinema?
We did. Probably the first thing my sister and I were taken to see was My Fair Lady, a sort of matinee performance, and we were just so badly behaved. My mum took us halfway through. Do you remember? I think it was 101 Dalmatians we went to see, and it's just that weird thing that other people say, so I know it's true. You could walk into a cinema and see a film halfway through and then just stay to watch the beginning bit again, because for some reason people did that. And why on earth would you do that? I don't know. It's really mad. It meant you could actually sit in a cinema and watch, the same film about 3 times over again for the same price. But some people did do that. But I remember inappropriately in intermission, because there was always an intermission, whatever the film's length was anyway, they could flog you some horrible drinks and like hot dog. They had a trailer for The Blood Beast Terror, of all films. And I'm pretty sure I remember this as being in the middle of 101 Dalmatians anyway. So yeah, that kind of was the first time I would have seen Peter Cushing on a big screen. And it was quite terrifying.
When did you put pieces together with like that film posters could be an actual career? Was it seeing them as a kid? In the 70s, you had like the big disaster movies and they all had those classic artwork and all that kind of thing. Was there any time then when you saw like a parallel with like, oh, somebody does that for a job?
Definitely seeing the posters at the cinema, but I think what might have started it actually would have been, it's the one book which everybody, mentions there. If you're a 70s horror kid, it's the one big book that everybody knows and had a copy of, which was the Dennis Gifford book, Pictorial History of Horror Movies. Anybody who's interested in horror had that book, and people like Mark Gatiss will always cite that as being their entry into horror. That had a few horror film posters within the pages. Of course, a lot of quite disturbing images for a kid to see. Anyway, though, some of it in colour as well, though. But I with an interest in horror films and then seeing the posters as well, it was like an adjunct to those films, and it just seemed that you didn't have to go into the cinema. You could actually look at the posters and get stuff out of it. And I was never going to be a filmmaker. Didn't want to act or anything, but I realised that probably film posters would be potential.
Did you ever copy any?
Oh yeah, all the time. Mostly, it was a bit later, and I was actually copying posters. So it would have been around the time of, as you mentioned, the Towering Inferno, the Hindenburg. Actually, I didn't copy. I actually created my own posters.
Yeah, your own variation. I like this scene in the film. I'm going to put that bit in the poster.
Yeah. Well, also, it's kind of basically the beginning of what I do now. It's just identifying the things which make the film interesting for you. And so I do remember doing my own poster for Close Encounters, my own poster for Star Wars, for instance, and possibly Rollerball, I think, I remember. I was using coloured crayons at the time, and I did experiment quite a lot with those, even at the beginning of my college courses as well, because I kind of thought it was a technique, kind of really practiced at. And I think the reason I gave up using colour pencils was because they were very versatile. Was actually couldn't get the depth of colour, and you couldn't get a good black at the end of the day, and paint became the default.
But you still use paint like a pencil though, right?
Yeah, apparently. We're always told at college never to use paint like a pencil. Always use a brush to, you have brush techniques and everything. Never use it like a pencil. So I'm going to use it like a pencil then. I think it's become more pronounced of late because, I do know the technique changes. The more you do, the more experience you have, and you learn ways of creating effects and doing things efficiently at the end of the day. It's all about, being able to deliver stuff to meet the deadline without spending too long on it, which would, mean the fee you're getting is actually diminishing each time you spend longer on something. It's a fine balance, and I think it's one of those difficulties illustrators sometimes have, that people think that if you just work on something for a couple of weeks, you should thus be paid for 2 weeks work. It just doesn't work like that. You get given a budget, and you have to decide, well, if I'm going to live off this money or on this money, then I can only spend a day and a half or 2 days or something. Everything takes longer ultimately. So I've learned to have a sort of an average price, a daily rate, if you like. The job will either take 2 days or as long as 6 days, which is the maximum I've ever worked on anything. And so on the basis of 300 quid a day, for instance, 2 days work will be 600 quid. 4 days, 1,200 quid. And so it's really kind of people have a better idea of what can be achieved then. And I say, you can reduce it down to a 2-day job, if you're not so ambitious with what you want on the poster. But, if people want an all singing, all dancing poster with loads of stuff going on, that's just going to take time and that's going to cost money. Otherwise, I'm paying for the job, which is a bit stupid.
From an artistic point of view as well, it's knowing when to stop.
Yeah, I learned that probably whilst I was at college, and probably in the first year working as well. And I do remember once somebody said that they were looking at my folio work and said, well, there's a nice illustration, but it's really overworked. It made me kind of think, saying, well, as soon as all the information is there and it's doing the job it's supposed to do, you don't have to do it anymore, because really then you're just indulging yourself, really. That's just pointless, really. There's nothing wrong with indulging yourself, of course, but you can't expect people to pay for that,
Yeah, exactly. You said you studied at Salisbury College of Art. Was that your first time away from home?
Yes, it was, although, it wasn't that far away, really. In the first 6 months, because it's a naive 16-year-old basically just out of school, so I would travel to Salisbury. There was a train which would take about 25 minutes, maybe less than that, even though for some reason I was going to use the bus, which is very stupid because it took an hour and a half. So I'd have to get up, really early in the morning. My dad would give me a lift to the station. Looking at it now, I felt really sorry for him. I shouldn't have done that. Sorry, Dad. So you're getting at 6:30 in the morning, so you can get me to the bus station in time to get the bus to get to college in time. But on the other hand, I quite like that because I do quite like traveling on public transport. I don't drive, so I do like train journeys. I really love train journeys. And at that time, I really loved the bus journeys because living in the middle of the countryside, the most beautiful sunrises in the morning and put you in a very good mood. I felt for the work, just relax your mind and all the things you'd be anxious about suddenly would kind of be melting away. Of course, come the end of the evening when you're traveling back, it seemed to become more outrageous.
Yeah.
So the first 6 months, I was daft enough to travel every day. But after that, it was quite clear that I just needed to stay in Salisbury. So that's where I kind of learned to be independent.
And this was the late 70s, so the music scene was going through an explosive time with punk rock coming to the forefront.
Yeah, so 76 to 1980. So 76, that I was the naive 16-year-old, petrified of the first punks that I saw, which were at art college. And, there's about 2 or 3 kids who travelled up to London to see Sex Pistols and the other bands. It really was the very beginning of the scene. So they're quite out there. And so you had that very early kind of DIY punk stuff. I remember some orange boiler suits, like kind of the sort of death row kind of stuff. And certainly all the safety pins and such like, which, hadn't at that moment in time become something that was a kind of cliche. It was still quite surprising and new and not really commonly seen at all. And it took about a year before that stuff became very much embedded in the public consciousness. But at that time, it was genuinely terrifying to see because people don't understand. There was no cultural reference point. There was nothing you could think of. Why would you want to do that? But it all kind of made sense very, very quickly. And I hadn't really been interested in contemporary music until that point. And then just suddenly, things just all clicked into place suddenly. Because also the same people really loved horror films, so they had horror film posters over their desks. Once you could relate the two, then, it kind of opened things up quite quickly.
Just another great touch point for you as well. Growing up as a kid, you had all that cool TV stuff, which put you on one track. Then you get to college, then you hit this other track as well. It's all these great little touch points which you're coming across. It's very, very cool.
Oh, spoiled rotten.
I believe you spent 4 years studying at college, then made the big jump to London in 1980. How was that for you, do you recall? Was it frightening? Did you know anybody there or anything like that?
Again, I was very lucky because 3 of the guys from the art college who were actually in a year above me, they'd already the year before moved to London. Basically, everybody had to move to London because there just wasn't the work elsewhere. And actually, if you wanted to work in anything which was of interest, which had some sort of media or cultural relationship, then it was where the film companies were, where the magazines were, record companies. Everything could possibly want to be involved with was all based in London. So everybody had to gravitate to London if you were really going to be serious about it. Otherwise, you're going to be locked into something far more provincial. Of course, it's not the case now, but that was the case then, though, because, no internet and no communication apart from seeing people face to face. My friends had, they were renting, the 3 of them renting a bedsit in Blackheath, and it's literally just a room with a gas cooker at one end and a gas heater at the other end. And then there was a communal, really grubby communal bathroom and toilet. And it was cheap. I don't think anybody would do this now, though, but I think students nowadays tend to expect quite a lot from their accommodation.
I live near Nottingham. You should see some of the student flats which are around there. It's like, damn.
Well, it was slightly Dickensian, if you like, in a way. The 4 of us shared this bed sit, so there was one single bed, and so 3 of us slept in sleeping bags on the floor, which kind of filled up the entire floor. You had to sleep in the sequence of who had to get up first to go to work. Because I was working from the bed sit, big freelance, and so I was always at the far end of the room next to the heater. So one by one, people would be leaving. I'd be the last person there, and all tucked up in my sleeping bag. So it was quite funny. I mean, it just meant in the evenings to avoid being crowded in this tiny little room. We just go to the pub every evening, which basically became the living room. But then when you were paying about something insane like 30p a pint of beer, which is what it was in 1980, you didn't feel that you were spending money really.
What was your game plan once arriving in London? Had you been given any kind of hints or leads as who to contact for work, or was it just a matter of like, I'm just going to throw myself in there?
There was no plan. There's nothing at all. It was just, again, it's part of being naive, I suppose, really. The whole life is ahead of you, and there are so many things you don't know. And so many things to discover. So, the fact that my friends were already working and clearly they found work, they were doing work they enjoyed as well. And one of them in particular was already doing some film poster work. And actually, probably through those first probably real jobs I had, kind of really came through those friends, their workplaces. I mean, they were good enough to put me forward for a couple of jobs. Didn't always get them. It's a very slow process. I lived in, what to describe as pretty much poverty, in the first 2 years, definitely, though. And eating bowls of, I seem to remember, broad beans in a broth of oxo.
Wow.
Yeah.
Because I think you got some work with the likes of NME, some adult magazines and educational material. That must be like a tough time, like you say, for 2 years, really struggling. But was it just rewarding for you to be living and working in London? Was you just aiming towards the big picture?
Oh, yeah. I mean, but, it was great fun. I mean, gradually other friends were moving up from college as well. So there was a kind of network we had already. And, sort of, I guess through people they knew from work where they were working, you'd be building up very slowly some sort of, work contacts and, socializing, I guess, with your friends.
Did you get to see much of the music scene when you were first there, to like proper experience everything you perhaps heard of at college?
Yeah, very much so. That side of things developed quite rapidly. Really, once you've gone to a couple of gigs, you kind of felt quite safe doing that, and it become a very important part of your social life, as well as going to the cinema, which is an awful lot because it was cheap, comparatively. And of course, that's also where when I discovered through a friend of mine the Scala Cinema and their programming, and so that kind of really opened up, I guess, sort of counterculture, if you like, which kind of existed there with the music anyway. But the sort of cult cinema stuff, was very much a learning curve as well. Seeing John Waters films for the first time, for instance. Old Universal films would be programmed there, and you see all sorts of quite unexpected things. You probably go along to see a specific film, but then there would always be another film with it, which wouldn't necessarily fit into the same category, genre, or whatever. So, the Scala was really good for that as a sort of film education, because you might have gone along to see something like Pink Flamingos and then end up watching some, sort of Carell with it. I remember going to see, I don't know what it was now, I think it was probably Rock and Roll Swindle, and then that was billed with Jubilee. So then you had this kind of Derek Jarman's film alongside something just far more commercial. So that kind of alerted you to how actually all the culture, pop culture that you kind of thought you knew, how it actually spread out into other areas, if you like, though. And it was quite a liberating time in that respect. Again, being very lucky, right place, right time. The Bat Cave opened up as an evening venue, a nightclub, which is basically really catering for me. Nobody else did for me. Because it was all my favourite music, and they would screen horror films, in the club as well, though. So
very cool.
And of course, what was fantastic was you go there. Not only were you seeing these great films, some of which you probably hadn't seen before, something like Suspiria, for instance, I probably hadn't seen it at the time. Getting all your favourite music, and then standing at the bar would be, Susie Sue, probably Mark Almond, Nick Cave, all these kind of people. You think, blimey, that's all the music I'm loving and listening to actually in the club right now, and they're standing in the bar as well. Though.
That's awesome. You would land your first movie commission, which I know it's not a poster you're a fan of, The Monster Club, which from an outsider point of view, I think it's a really fun poster. But your original submission was deemed too scary, which is in a way perhaps the ideal compliment for what you'd shortly go on to do after when you hooked up with Palace Pictures. They were a new company at the time, right, Palace?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, brand new. They formed out of on the basis of the Scala Cinema and understanding there's an audience for all these cult films they were showing, and because video was really taking off, the idea of home entertainment, and so they recognised there was a market for stuff. So it was Palace Video formed before Palace Pictures, so they're already establishing their sort of pre-certification. Also, it's quite important to understand roster of films which they were buying licenses for, and so they were releasing all the John Waters films. Their biggest seller, apparently, there was 2 live concert films Gary Newman had put out, micro music for micro people, I think they were called. That was their biggest seller, weirdly. I think they also then realised that the potential not only to release stuff on video, but actually do what they did best, which was using the cinema itself actually to start their own distribution on. So at the point I met them, they had literally just released their first film, which was Diva, the French thriller. And so luckily for me, the second film they were going to distribute was The Evil Dead. So the timing was absolutely perfect. I just couldn't make it up.
What do you remember about their initial pitch for this new horror film called The Evil Dead?
I think they just picked up at Cannes Film Festival, and basically they said, we've got this horror film. They described it as, a really sort of a cheap B movie, but they said, it's incredibly gory, really good fun, and they said that, horror fans will love it. They said it's really cheesy, badly made, and they kind of prepared me for it, and it kind of delivered everything they just described. It was cheap, and it was a B movie, but of course it had a lot more going on than most films that were attempting to do that kind of thing. I recognised that little elements of Hammer in there, nods to things like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, a lot of American stuff, but I did think there was a slight element of the English influence in there as well, though. I can't remember, I might have brought it up as a subject matter with the one time I met Sam Raimi and had a proper chat. But really, I think the essential thing was when I saw it, I thought, well, this is quite extreme for cinema. And of course, it ultimately was trimmed quite extensively. I guess the main thing is that Palace were new. I was kind of very new at my game as well, I guess, though. And so they didn't really know how to commission posters, and I didn't really know how to do them either. So
that's the most punk rock thing ever.
We're all absolutely clueless. But it was a really good learning experience for both of us, really. I mean, I know that for a fact they were embarrassed to tell me, but the artwork for Diva, the film poster for their first film, was, I think, a mixture of illustration and photography. So I think it was like a helmet repeated twice, and it had been airbrushed, heavily retouched, and done perhaps with a tear down the middle as part of the design. Anyway, that artwork they apparently managed to leave in a pub one night, and they never saw it again. So I thought, well, that's it's very professional, isn't it?
That's awesome.
Only the distributor.
Yeah, brilliant. Because obviously the film had a US version of the poster, but I believe they wanted a more punk rock or rock and roll style for the UK release.
Yeah, I think they just thought it didn't really work. It didn't shout B movie. It didn't really capture this sort of the trash aesthetic which they felt would be perfect for the film. And as you quite rightly identify, their core audience, as far as they were concerned, was not just simply horror fans, but horror fans who the sort of people who'd be going to the Batcave. I guess they, sort of goths before goths even existed. They were kind of goths of sorts, which were just basically kind of punks who just decided to wear black a lot.
Yeah,
and there was a big sort of rockabilly revival going on, which was part of the whole sort of punk thing as well, though. So there was a big interest in kind of 50s stuff, and of course, the 50s, you kind of also think of 50s B movies as well. So there's a mix of rock and roll and sort of trashy stuff. So that's really, I think, perhaps where the marketing for The Evil Dead really originated.
Your artwork for that film, it'll be forever associated with that movie because it captures the vibe and I'm going to say the nastiness of it perfectly. What were your feelings when the film was banned and pulled from the shelves? Was it like, shit, finally got some hit artwork and now it's being pulled?
I think I was just amused, actually, because I thought, well, okay, it's a bit extreme, but nobody's going to be going to watch the film without knowing what the content really is going to be anyway, though. And word of mouth was selling it anyway. Plus also, as it came out simultaneously on video as well, so you could rent it as well as going to the cinema to see it. So it meant that a lot more people were able to see the film. Perhaps that's probably the problem, that kids could watch it at home on the home video. Ultimately, I don't think anybody became a serial killer as a result of watching Evil Dead. If anything, all it would do is just make them want to go and rent more horror.
Yeah, exactly. From then, you became like a force of the Palace catalogue, really. I'm sure some would say that the posters of your films, like a lot of films in the VHS era, were perhaps better than the films themselves.
Yeah, I've been told that in the past. I don't know if that's really true, because my work wasn't that great at the time. I am aware of my limitations, and my limitations were many at the time. It's taken a long time to get to the level where I actually feel comfortable looking at my work now, where a lot of the stuff I did was not that great at the time. It only turned out a few stinkers.
One of your most well-known projects is the Nightmare on Elm Street series and its UK releases. The original was commissioned through Palace, right? But what is the connection there? Because I've always associated the original with CBS Fox. Simply
that Palace were the distributor in the UK, so that was the only reason. So they had the freedom to choose whatever campaign they liked for the British territory, which is what they owned. The American territories and other territories had their own poster campaign. Once again, I think Palace just thought that they didn't feel the poster was going to reach the British audience in quite the same way it might have done the American audience. I wasn't going to do the poster initially. I did go to a press screening, actually at the Scala Cinema, and I remember thinking it was quite an original film, as it certainly was at the time. And of course, you just kind of tend to see the cliches now because, it influenced a lot of other films and so many tropes you're familiar with now. But at the time, it was actually quite original and actually quite scary as well. But probably about 3 weeks after I saw the film, that two friends of mine were offered the poster. They set up a design business and they were also doing work for Palace Pictures by that time as well. So, Palace kind of thought that it should have a slightly classier treatment and, didn't see it as an out-and-out horror film. They wanted almost to market it as something, almost like a sort of high-class thriller, if you like. But anyway, I think after discussions, my friends kind of thought actually perhaps I would probably be better placed to market the film, in conjunction with them, of course. So they were going to handle the design, layout and stuff. Basically, what we've ended up with was it was a cross between a flyer that had been supplied by the Americans, which was just like a little picture of a suburban street with the knives tearing through the top of the poster. So really, that was the kind of origin, and that's kind of really where they were looking at going. Basically, they didn't want to show a monster. They didn't want to show overt horror in any form. That's really where it came from, though. And, for me, it was just adding the sleeping head just to give it some sort of human content. And then, as I always say, I couldn't really help myself and just added in the blades anyway. Something I've talked about probably over the last year, maybe a bit longer. It's just something that's come up in conversation. And I tried to explain how you make a film poster engaging. And mostly it's with faces, creating characterful faces and trying to portray emotion and such like. But it's eye contact is always very powerful within a film poster. And of course, what's unusual about Nightmare on Elm Street, there's absolutely no eye contact at all because he's asleep. So you're kind of robbed of that contact, but I think that kind of made it slightly more interesting anyway, because, you have the face which you're kind of looking at, trying to engage with this human face, but she's not engaging with you at all, which seems very rude.
That's really interesting. I never thought of it that way.
It does make it an interesting poster from that perspective.
Definitely. And then you'd followed it up with the iconic Freddy's Revenge artwork, but nothing for part 3, which for the UK they used a photograph. Was there ever a pitch for Dream Warriors?
I don't know how that happened, really, whether it was a budget consideration or whether they simply felt that it wasn't necessary to do anything lavish with a poster, because they had a few press deals and obviously they used that one. Basically, I kind of handled the design of it, the layout of it. I had to deal with the hand lettering and everything. But yeah, I don't know why they shied away from a painting.
They probably figured the buzz was getting up already for the Freddy Krueger character and just thought, slap a photo on there, people will come and see it.
I think that there is an element of that in there. I think it was, I would say with all respect, but actually there's no respect at all. Actually, I think they're just being a bit lazy.
Maybe, because you would return to work on part 4, and I love both of your posters for part 5, but neither were used for the VHS release, and they've used like almost a very friendly looking Freddy Krueger on part 5. I don't know what went off there.
Well, it's also partly maybe the sort of home entertainment industry had kind of moved on a little bit. And of course, importantly, desktop computing had eviscerated the illustrated covers and posters to an extent. There was a lot less work for somebody like me to do. Fortunately, I was always working in other areas anyway, though. So I had freelance work, which was not anything to do with horror, very dull jobbing stuff, nevertheless, allowing me to survive. I mean, Palace, they didn't last much longer after that anyway, though. I think by the time Nightmare 5 came along, they'd already gone into administration. So that was handled by, I think it was Entertainment, the company, UK. And so they actually did kind of return to an illustrated poster with that. But so Palace weren't involved any longer at that point. And then when Palace went under Pop Somebody Else, that always happens though, and filling their boots was Tartan Films, who were equally keen to release stuff that wasn't necessarily mainstream, but part of that was trying to make stuff mainstream, actually taking films which are kind of a bit more experimental, a bit more sort of contentious, if you like, in their content, and just trying to create a buzz about them. And so they kind of filled that gap. I ended up, as you know, working with Tartan for about 10 years, I think, though, and didn't do any illustration work for them.
Was that a shift more into digital stuff?
It was all Photoshop. A lot of it was adapting existing artwork, trying to improve it sometimes with a bit of extra photography. What I did realise quite quickly, because obviously I was working at that time within a studio environment. I had my desk space, and around me were film posters being designed. And it was quite interesting to see how their digital approach worked, using Photoshop, how people comp stuff together. What I did realise, and I think correctly, was that the skills in compositing photographs together, creating compositions, colour, balance, all that kind of stuff, actually does need an illustrator's eye, an artist's eye. And I think that because a lot of the people doing this stuff, they're working on, trying to create high resolution files, and the machinery at that time was a pretty basic. Mobile phone has more computing power than the average desktop at the time. But just you notice that they're basically using technical skill to create images, people who are confident on a computer as opposed to somebody with an artist's eye. You would have noticed that at the time there was a lot of video cover work and film poster work which kind of just looked very bland, and it was quite hard to point out why it wasn't working. Well, it's because it's being designed by a technician, not an artist. So the urgency for that technician was to get everything in there as high resolution as possible. They do silly things like put one face slightly in front of the other. They just airbrush in, in Photoshop, sort of grey shadow, which actually didn't really sculpt around the face where it's supposed to be appearing. And actually when you add grey over flesh colour, it just goes this horrible colour, and actually shadows don't look like that at all. They actually take on darker hues of whatever is there, like a darker flesh colour, for instance. Shadows aren't grey. You don't just spray on grey and say that's a shadow. Just horrible.
So you needed that illustration eye to be able to make all that kind of work.
But nobody's going to employ an illustrator to use Photoshop. So the thing is that in the 10 years I did stuff for Tartan, I did apply my illustration skills to Photoshop. I kind of understood how you could make things look slightly better, just having that bit of extra artistic knowledge, if you like.
Definitely. And it could be said you would, in a way, kind of come home once you began working with Arrow Films. Was it around 2010?
Something like that. But it's odd. Of course, Tartan ultimately went into administration as well. Again, it seemed to be quite lucky that when Paris went down, Tartan popped up. And then when Tartan went down, Arrow came along with the offer of work, which, snowballed quite quickly. And that certainly did shift things, I think, considerably in terms of, my work and also other illustrators, of course, as well. So suddenly had painted covers again. The thinking behind that was actually to go back to the aesthetic of the 1980s, because of course a lot of the stuff they were releasing was reissues of 1980s films, so they were trying to just capture the spirit of that packaging style. And so by coming to me, they weren't looking for new illustration work, they were looking for old illustration work, if you like. Taking it to an old dog, if you like, and say, give us what you did there.
What's cool though, you've had all that experience in the meantime, so you can give them what they want, but with, again, a modern twist on it in a way.
When I was working on things like The Evil Dead, I wasn't actually conscious decision to make something look, 1980s. I mean, what was 1980s? It's just happened to be the period we were working in. And as far as I was concerned, all I was doing was drawing on the vast library of B-movie posters from the 1940s onwards, really.
Just happened to be doing it in the 80s. That's all it was.
Exactly. And it's the same with Nightmare on Elm Street. I mean, there was nothing consciously era related in that work. It just happened to be done in that era. So, people want to say 1980s, that's fine, but it's drawing on the experience of previous eras. So might as well just call it, 20th century. And the fact that the 1980s seems to have been a well-loved golden era for horror. So, for instance, conventions now, on the teenagers whose favourite films will be stuff made in that era before they were born. It's just interesting to see how powerful those films have remained. Of course, it's weird for me because it's almost the equivalent of me, in my sort of teenage years or my early 20s, revering 1930s horror films, Universal films. Of course, the level of sophistication then from 1930s is way, way behind when I was, watching those films in the 1970s. And so when you look at films in the 1980s, they're still, very much the texture of contemporary film. Colour, you have, very sophisticated visuals. But, a lot of those films are drawing on previous eras anyway, though. So, again, a classic 1980s horror film is actually, again, a 20th century product, if you like.
This, recent upsurge in reissues of films and a boom in your style of illustration artwork, you've been able to take on your own reimaginings of classic films, which you didn't get the chance to do back in the day, such as Lost Boys, Fright Night, American Werewolf, just to name a few. Is there one you'd still like to work on?
No, I'm very lucky as it is, kind of getting to work up images from, all the things I've always loved, like when it's Universal, Hammer. I'm just lucky to be able to do anything really at the end of the day. But, I think it's all about the aesthetic that you bring to a job. Obviously, your listeners won't be able to see the posters around me, but there's about half a dozen Belgium posters for Hammer films, and they're really beautiful. So I've been really trying to bring that feel into some of the recent stuff. The technique is subtly changing. Interesting, being able to recreate the feel of something from a past era, but in your own with your own technique and way of working. I've never actually consciously tried to emulate somebody else's work. I always thought it was very important that you do find your own way. There's no urgency for me to intentionally deviate from what I do in order to stay ahead, if such, because staying ahead is really just being about being aware of what is around you, being aware of what interests you, and actually, doing what you feel is going to work for any particular job. All these decisions are made in the subconscious, and people do ask, where do you get your ideas for the compositions and such like, and they often do just come in dreams at night time.
Really? Wow.
I kind of trust the subconscious. So if something comes to me in a dream, and I can usually remember it quite clearly, then all I have to do is recreate exactly what I saw in the dream. And largely, it tends to work. It's almost supernatural, isn't it?
Is that something that's travelled with you all these years?
Yeah, I think so. I think the thing is, though, you're thinking about a job, you go to sleep on it, essentially. And I think because the mind is relaxed, then it kind of, and also in a dream state, it's a bit more free form as well. So whereas you're torturing yourself, trying to work out how you can use certain elements in a film, how you compose them and make things work, what colours should you use, all this is floating around in your head, and suddenly, a few things will ping up, because in a dream, you're not constrained by other worries at all. So it's very weird how that happens. I don't think it's by any means unique, but it's very handy when you really can't think of anything.
What's your process now, which you go through with a new commission? At what point does a digital element come into it? Is it literally just the scanning stage at the end of it?
Well, that's only truly digital part of the finished item. It's all still paint on paper. But yes, it's part of that whole thing I was telling you earlier on about budgets and deadlines. You have to get from A to B as fast as possible, otherwise you don't survive. Particularly Blu-ray cover, where budgets aren't attached to it in quite the way they would have been. I might be paid something now for a Blu-ray cover, which is the equivalent of literally almost what I was paid for a VHS cover in the 1980s. So if you consider allowing for inflation and stuff, it's actually, fees are a lot less. I mean, because the returns are a lot less.
Is there anything to this day from when you first seriously started getting into illustration which you still use regularly, maybe a style of paint or brush, or do you still buy something from the same place? Do you have a go-to?
Well, I'm still using the same paint. I mean, the brushes, they tend to vary over the years because the manufacturing, I think, has changed, and they're mass-produced in a way which actually can be a bit annoying. I find that brushes now tend to hold more water. It gets, drawn up into the metal holding, if you like. It can be held, and then when you're working on something delicately, suddenly the water then decides it's going to unleash itself through the paint. I did buy sable brushes at one point in the past, thinking they were the professional brush of choice, but the technique I use is very unkind to brushes, and I find that they last one or two illustrations and then they're no good anymore. Also found that whereas I used to have a variety of brush sizes to work with, largely I've got, there's one size which will kind of do all the fine detail and some of the heavier work, a couple of other brushes which might just fill in where big blocks of colour or black needs to go on. So you learn what works best. And the pigments I work with, it's a very, very limited range of colours. I think it's about 7 because, I know that I get all the colours I need just from a very limited range. So, I haven't bought a green paint for decades because I know that I can make green out of yellow and a blue, and I'll get all the greens that I need. You learn, what works best for colour, and also mostly the colours I use are what I've described as having high permanency, which means that the colours won't fade over the years at all. And stuff that was painted in the early 80s, it's all the colours are still there, as bright, as deep as they ever were. So, the pigments tend to be quite stable. I mean, obviously, if you stick anything in bright sunlight, for days on end, over years and years, there's going to be some, fading's going to happen. But then nobody generally kind of is daft enough to do that, really.
Kind of just to end things, Graham, you recently released your book, Hung, Drawn and Executed.
That's right, yeah.
You've got an exhibition called Colours of the Night starting in September in London. Is this like your most productive time yet in your 40 years in the industry?
Yeah, it is. The pandemic really wrapped things up as well. I mean, it has been literally the busiest couple of years I've ever had. I mean, the exhibition is going to be, I'd say 50% of it, if not 60, 70% of it was all produced within the last year and a half during the pandemic. So largely it's newer stuff. I think the oldest piece in there is probably only about 3 or 4 years old. I think there's one piece which might appear in hung, drawn and executed. So most of the stuff will be going to the next book, which hopefully will be coming out next Halloween 2022. So I've probably already got enough stuff to fill that volume, but that won't probably go to print till summer next year. So we'll have a lot of options on what can go in. So I think it will be a better book as well for that reason, because I think the standard of work will be much higher. I've got good hopes for this gallery. It's just nice having a proper West End location. It's not a huge gallery. There'll be 16 pieces, but it's sort of hot on the heels of the Fright Fest as well. I'll be bigging it up as much as possible during that. Also, it's a big nice little taster for the book. Fingers crossed, I might even sell some pieces as well, so that'd be quite nice.
Excellent. You'll be back on the convention circuit?
Yeah, I'm not going anywhere. Well, the first big one will be the London Film and Comic Con, which fingers crossed it will go ahead. And of course, Robert England's one of the main guests there, so that's a chance to flog just a few Nightmare on Elm Street prints.
How have your encounters been with Robert England over the years? Surely you've crossed paths a few times.
I only met him once, and that was years and years ago. Yeah, it's very possible if he finds himself signing lots of my prints, then he might want to come down and visit the table. I mean, that happened with a chap from American Werewolf in London. He was signing upstairs and realised he was signing lots of the same print, and so he came down to say hello, and that was very nice. So then there's the smaller event at Oakley Court. Has more resonance for me because it's, next door to Bray Studios where a lot of the early Hammer films were shot. So as I say, it's a smaller event, but that's Halloween, October the 31st. And then the next really big one will be Sheffield Horror Con in May next year, which fingers crossed again, will go ahead.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to seeing you at one of those. I've taken up way too much of your time, but I appreciate all your stories. It's been great chatting with you.
It's been good dredging up some memories. Well, thank you very much as well, though. I've enjoyed it.
Nice one, mate. You take care. I'll speak to you soon.
I will do. And you as well. Cheers.
Thanks so much to the brilliant Graham Humphreys for spending some time with us here on the Straight to Video podcast. Be sure to head on over to grahamhumphreys.com to check out his amazing catalogue of work. Some of my favourites, other than the iconic Evil Dead and Nightmare on Elm Street, have to be Hide and Shriek. That's one hell of a creepy film. And also The Stuff, which as a kid creeped me the hell out, and even today it still has the same effect. If you've enjoyed this show and regularly listen to these chats and would maybe like to get a little more involved, then I have a Straight to Video Patreon where you can get behind the scenes access to the show, a bonus podcast, exclusive merch, and early heads up on guests. Support tiers start at just £2 a month, £2, not even a cup of coffee, and it really does make a difference in the ongoing growth of this show. Head on over to patreon.com/STVpod and I'd love to have you on there. Also, if you'd like to check out over 100 episodes of the podcast, then they're all nicely available at stvpod.com or wherever you listen to podcasts, so please be sure to follow so you don't miss a single episode. Alright, that's all for today's show. Really appreciate you listening and for all the kind words, likes, shares and messages. But until we chat again, take care and speak soon.